Hi, thank you for the kind invitation to talk about my favorite subject today. As Greg said, I'm Libby Dayton. I'm a soil scientist at Ohio State University, and we've been working on a project, we're calling it On-Field Ohio, and our charge is to evaluate and, as necessary, revise the Ohio Phosphorus Risk Index. And as Eric just said, the Ohio P-Index is part of a nutrient management plan, and we also use the Russell Erosion Program, which is part of the nutrient management planning. So there's a lot of overlap here. So today I just want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing and how that hopefully will help farmers. As Eric just pointed out, we really need to make some substantial reductions in some of this runoff phosphorus. So we're looking for some areas where we can achieve those reductions. So again, just to reiterate, picking up where Eric left off, the P-Index is actually a USDA NRCS tool. It is part of the Code 590 Nutrient Management Standard. There is an increased emphasis in the revised 590 standard to utilize state P indices. We aren't the only state who has a P-Risk index, and we aren't the only state that's also evaluating and hopefully improving their P-Index. The P-Index also looks at the Tri-State Fertility Guidelines, and it also includes some of the 4R nutrient stewardship. So, you know, it's kind of the circle of life. A lot of these things are well integrated. But increasingly, the Ohio P-Risk Index is being used to judge farmer performance. So as we're going through this process, we really want to get it right. We want the P-Risk Index score, which is the risk of runoff, to more accurately reflect what we see coming off at the edge of a farm field. So today, for today's talk, I just want to keep it simple because we don't have a lot of time. So I'm sure you've heard a lot today that Ohio farmers are being asked to reduce their phosphorus runoff. In fact, for the Western Lake Erie Basin, they're being asked to reduce 40% of the phosphorus loading into the Western Lake Erie Basin. So today, what I want to talk about is, does farmer management, does crop management matter, and is there any hope? Can we make these reductions that we're being called on to make? So this is the Cliff Notes of the current Ohio Phosphorus Risk Index. So you see there's multiple parameters that are considered. Some of them are physical transport type parameters like erosion potential, connectivity to water, the runoff class. Some of them are more farmer management practices. How much soil phosphorus, soil test P, do you have in your soil? How much fertilizer or manure are you intending to apply? And by what method are you intending to apply that fertilizer? So you get a sub-value score for each of those parameters, and then you add those all up, and so then you supposedly come out with a low, medium, high, or very high risk of phosphorus runoff. So we're kind of evaluating all these parameters, how they're weighted, and how they're scored. But for today, I want to focus on erosion potential, soil test phosphorus, and fertilizer placement method, and how we see these things affecting what we see coming off at the edge of the field in the runoff. So we think about runoff a little bit differently, and we have to, because we have this huge amount of edge-of-field runoff data, massive numbers, lots of samples. So statistically, we actually worked hard, and we've split these runoff events off between what we would consider to be a spike runoff event or a baseline runoff event. So a spike runoff event is always associated with a short-term, high-risk practice. It can be a gully washer rainstorm. It could be a major tillage, erosion right after a major tillage. It could be that risky time period after a fresh fertilizer application. And then there's the baseline risk. Well, that's the everyday. When a farmer isn't even out in the field, there's nothing really going on, but it's raining and there's runoff, either coming out the tile or coming off the surface. There's not really much going on, but that's a baseline runoff event, and what's happening during those times. Those are always associated with long-term dribbling erosion. As we're driving up here from Columbus today, we see a lot of naked soil, and so that contributes to that erosion. No field cover. And then also your soil test phosphorus levels. So a little bit about our research process, because I'm going to be shifting between these things. What I want to show you today are some of the field scale, edge of field runoff data that we're actually collecting. What are we actually seeing at the edge of the field? But we're also going to talk about, well, based on what we see at the edge of the field, how would that affect if we extrapolate that across Ohio? And then also we're filling in some gapped areas by doing some small plot simulated runoff work. So you probably have all seen these setups, the edge of field monitoring setups. Most of our fields have both tile and surface being monitored and runoff being collected. We have 29 fields. We have 8 in Grand Lake St. Mary's, 7 in the Scioto watershed, and 14 in the Western Lake Erie Basin. Most of them, as I say, have both surface and tile, but not necessarily. And I always like to say a special thank you to our participating farmers that allow us to put the equipment on the edge of their field and share their farmer management information with us at an excruciating level of detail. So the other thing that we're doing, as I say, we're going to say, okay, well, this is what we see on our 29 fields. Well, what if we see these things across Ohio? So we've actually developed a simulator so we can simulate across Ohio what we see. So we pulled together 6,134 point locations across Ohio. These are from the ag statistics, so we filtered out, this is row crop agriculture spots. So for each point location, we know all the soil survey data, we know the slope length, the slope steepness, we know the crop management zone. And then knowing all that about each point location, we can run crop management scenarios across those points, and then we can get an idea of what do we see. So let's start with soil test phosphorus. Right now, the Ohio P-Risk Index says your Bray P1 times 0.07 is your score for soil test phosphorus. So that means if you got 100 part per million Bray P, you get 7 points on your P-index score, which doesn't sound like a lot, considering 100 is a lot of soil test P. So let's start with what do we see in our study fields. These are the soil test values for our study fields. As you can see, we have a really good range of soil test P, which as a researcher, I always want the whole range. So you see we have a few that would be hovering in the deficiency areas. A lot of them are within the agronomic range, which is the 2 horizontal bars. And then we have a few that are really quite high. So this is what we see. So on our bottom axis, we see our Malick 3 soil test P. And then on our y-axis, we see runoff dissolved phosphorus, and this is just the baseline. So we've removed all the fertilizer spikes. So baseline runoff, just dissolved P, and you can see that as soil test P goes up, your runoff P goes up. They're very strongly related. So the blue dots are the surface samplers. Well, I just said they're very strongly related, but look at the green triangles. They're very poorly related. There really is no relationship to soil test P. That's what's coming out the tile. So the good news is it looks up until, your soil test P gets up around 200. You don't see a big effect in what's coming out the tile. Again, this is just baseline runoff dissolved P. We see a strong relationship with from the surface runoff. So let's say, so now we know this relationship. So using this relationship, we can look at, well, then what is the runoff? What are we going to see across Ohio? So we did a survey of the soil test labs in Ohio, and they graciously gave us all their soil test data going back to 1992. So our simulator randomly selects a soil test P value from that survey. And so these are the soil test values across Ohio. And the range goes from about 2 to about 700 part per million. This is Malick 3P. And so based on your soil test P and our relationship, this is what we would expect to see, and this is what we do see in our field scale work. For runoff dissolved P for baseline, ranges between 0.006 and 2.2 part per million. So this is what we would expect to see across Ohio based on the soil test P as it is right now. Now if we take, what's the load? So if we take the concentration that we just showed you and we estimate the flow that would be coming off of each of those points, then we see that from a load standpoint, the range in runoff dissolved P is between 0.06 and about almost 4 pounds per acre. So let's talk about erosion. What do we see for erosion in Ohio? We do use the Russell, which is the Revised Universal Soil Loss Equation, to estimate Russell. So let's go back to our edge of field scale work. This is the average runoff total P baseline across for 3 years, what we see coming off our field. So the top graph is the surface samplers. The bottom graph is the tile samplers. So the first thing you notice is, on average, really a lot, what's coming off the surface has a much higher concentration than typically what we see coming out the tile. The other thing about this is the dark part of the bar is our friend runoff dissolved P baseline, but the light green part of the bar is the particulate bound P. So now we're going to start talking about erosion. So what's bound to the erosion that's coming off at the edge of the field? What's bound to that mud? And so for the surface samplers, on average, 73% of the total runoff is particulate bound. From the tile, about 52% of what's coming out the tile is particulate bound. So this reminds us that erosion matters. So let's see how erosion matters in Ohio. So I brought, just an example, I brought 2 crop management scenarios to compare. So the first one, well, what we're looking at is the crop management scenario that would have very different soil disturbance. And we're using the soil tillage intensity rating to establish the level of soil disturbance. So our crop management scenario 1 is no-till beans followed by no-till corn. It has a soil tillage intensity rating of 2.6. And we'll compare that to something maybe a little bit more typical in Ohio, crop management scenario 3, which is no-till before beans, but then a fall chisel after beans, and then a spring cultivate before corn. So comparing crop management 1 to crop management 3, this is how, I hope you guys can see this, this is how erosion looks in Ohio running the Russell program. So for the crop management scenario 1, which is all no-till, the maximum soil erosion across the whole state is 3.7 ton per acre. But then as soon as you put that chisel in the ground, and this is the rotation average, the erosion goes up considerably, especially when you get into areas where you start to get some rolling hills, when you get out of the western Lake Erie Basin. And then your maximum erosion is 20.5 ton per acre. So there's a huge effect of a huge range of erosion going on in Ohio. And from a, what do they call it, the T-value standpoint, we're way below that, the tolerance level. But from a phosphorus runoff standpoint, we have a lot of phosphorus moving with the soil. So, in fact, the difference, the reduction, moving from crop management scenario 3 down to crop management scenario 1, moving to much reduced tillage, moving into no-till, you could have on average an 84% reduction in erosion. So let's see how that affects runoff. So now we've talked about erosion. So erosion matters for runoff total P. So does soil test P. So we're not just looking at how much mud is in your runoff, but also how much phosphorus is associated with all that mud. So we're going to do a multiple regression now. And what we find is that for the surface samplers and for the tile samplers, using the relationship using soil test phosphorus as well as erosion, runoff suspended sediments, we have a really good relationship, and we can predict, we can estimate, we can calculate what your runoff total P concentration would be across our 6,000 data points. So using that relationship, this is what surface plus tile, runoff total P load, this is pound per acre per year of phosphorus loss across 6,000 data points in Ohio. So what we see, so you can see again in the no-till situation, there's way less runoff total P coming off. Whereas when we move into crop management 3, when you get into those pink dots, that's more than 10 pound per acre per year. Now, we didn't change the soil test P levels on these fields. The only thing that's changed is the farmer management, and so that has changed the erosion, and that's what's controlling the runoff levels. So for the no-till, the range in runoff total phosphorus pound per acre ranges from 0.08 to a little over 11 pound per acre. But then when you start disturbing that soil and you start kicking up that erosion, it ranges from 0.14 to 53 pound per acre of P. So again, comparing crop management scenario 3 to crop management scenario 1, by reducing the tillage, by keeping a field cover, by reducing the erosion, on average, you can reduce runoff total P by 61%. Well, they're asking us for a 40% reduction in the Western Lake Erie Basin. So we've just shown you a couple of ways where we can achieve those reductions, hopefully without disrupting your production. So I want to talk about, I hope I'm doing okay on time, I want to talk about one more thing, which is fertilizer placement method. So when I think about fertilizer placement method, I think about focusing on the risky practice, not the geography, not where is the field, but what's the practice that's going on in the field. I think everybody understands intuitively that a fresh fertilizer application is a high-risk practice. But what we don't know is how many instances of it are there across a watershed in any given season, where are these applications happening, and then you always need the coincidence of a runoff event in order to actually realize the risk. So here we're really talking about a risk, not necessarily an absolute. So if we look at, so these fertilizer applications really are the spike events. So this is what the spike events look like for our actual edge of field data. So again, the blue line, run along, that's the line that we showed you earlier, the relationship between soil test P and runoff dissolved P. That's the baseline line. So those red stars are the spikes from the surface samplers, and then the little green circles are actually the spikes from the tile samplers. So once again, we notice that the magnitude of the spikes from the surface runoff are way, way greater than any spike we ever see coming out the tile. And I hope some of this is good news for tile, because I know tile is really vilified in Ohio. So these are all due to fertilizer applications. Most of these are due to surface fertilizer applications. So you can see our runoff dissolved P went from less than 1 part per million, and now it's shot up to 18 part per million. So while you don't have that many spikes, they can be very dramatic, and you can lose a lot of phosphorus in a short period of time. And again, that blue line is our baseline level. So the spike above baseline can be quite dramatic. So what do we have to say about spikes? All bets are off for the runoff spike risk. These need to be managed very specifically, and they need to be managed separately from the baseline. They're always associated with a high-risk practice, such as a fertilizer application or a big soil disturbance due to a tillage, or with a gully wash or rainstorm. They are not related to the soil test level. So when we think about spikes, it's all about the magnitude. The magnitude of the spike for surface is always greater than the tile, and it's always greater than the baseline. So we weren't seeing enough fertilizer application methods in our real data. They weren't coming fast enough, so we started an additional project to augment our information collecting. So we've started a project, I don't know if Harold Waters is here, but it's with Harold Waters, and we're working out at the Western Experiment Station, doing small plot simulated rainfall, and we're comparing different fertilizer placement methods across varying types of fertilizer, different P sources, and different levels of surface cover. So as I say, we're working out the Western Experiment Station. We're on a strong Cosby silty clay loam, 2% slope. We actually apply kind of a short-term gully washer rainstorm. We collect all the runoff for about 30 minutes, and then we analyze it for runoff dissolved P and N, runoff suspended sediment, and runoff total P and N. In this experiment, we applied 200 pounds of MAP. So the reason we're doing it across three different surface cover levels is the current P index says, this is what the current P index says about fertilizer placement method. Looks at two things really. How soon do you incorporate your fertilizer or not? And or, the big red or, have you surface applied it on a certain level of field cover or growing cover crop? Have you applied it on a certain level of cover? So this is what we're testing. So the surface levels, this year we did crop residue, less than 10%, about 50%, and greater than 80%. We did 5 fertilizer placement methods. So we looked at surface broadcast, banding with a planter, surface broadcast followed by incorporation with a field cultivator, and surface broadcast followed by incorporation with a chisel disc. So what we were trying to do, and Harold actually came up with these methods, is we wanted to see that full range of soil disturbance incorporation. So again, the plots are 2 by 2 meter. We collect all the runoff for 30 minutes, homogenize the sample, and then off it goes to the lab for all the analyses. So this is what we see. So again, we're just looking at runoff dissolved P part per million, which is milligram per liter here. Runoff total P actually looks almost exactly like this because everything that's coming off this field, these plots, is coming from the fertilizer, which of course is very soluble. And so again, you can see there's a humongous difference through the fertilizer placement method, but the green bars, the 3 green bars, are the 10%, 50%, 80% residue cover. And you can see you don't see a big difference among the green bars. So it's telling us that there really isn't an effect of residue cover. Residue cover is not providing protection against runoff phosphorus here. However, if we look at the runoff suspended sediment, because now we have to ask ourselves, well, yeah, we're incorporating our fertilizer, but are we kicking up erosion? So if we look at runoff suspended sediments in gram per liter, we see humongous differences due to fertilizer placement method, but now we also see humongous differences due to surface cover. So we do see that as you at decreased levels of surface cover, you do have increased levels of sediment, which is erosion coming off the field. So far we're having really great results. This actually is a 3-year study because we can only be out in the field at certain times of the year. So what we're trying to do is optimize fertilizer placement method across erosion risk. We're going to be needing to find a balance because every hand goes up and that's the first thing they ask. Are you saying we should start tilling? No. No. We actually do run those because we want to show the risk of that soil disturbance. But what we're seeing so far for this first year is that any of the incorporation method, whether it's banding or the cultivator or the chisel disc, resulted in a greater than 90% reduction in both the runoff P concentration and the load. So here's another huge opportunity for P runoff reduction. So that's a lot. So let's review. Again, we see our runoff dissolved P baseline across Ohio is going to range from about 0.606 to a little less than 4 pound per acre per year. But that's just the dissolved P. Now let's bring erosion into that equation because erosion matters. So we'll remind you that about 73% of our surface runoff total P is particulate bound P, and that brings us back to erosion. And then does crop management scenario matter? Yes. So again, comparing crop management scenario 1, which was no-till, to crop management scenario 3, which had that fall chisel, and we see The range in runoff total P goes from 0.8 to 11 pound per acre, and for crop management 3 from 0.14 to 53 pound per acre of phosphorus loss. Huge opportunities to reduce that level of loss. In fact, by moving from crop management 3 more toward crop management 1, you can achieve a 61% on average reduction in runoff total phosphorus and an 84% reduction in erosion. So those are some big opportunities for reductions. And then back to fertilizer placement method. By getting the fertilizer in contact with the soil, hopefully without kicking up too much erosion, you can get a greater than 90% reduction in risk of runoff if you have a gully washer rainstorm shortly after you apply that fertilizer. So that was a lot, but I think there's a lot of good news here. I mean, I think that there really is a lot of hope here that we can achieve these reductions, and a lot of it is going to come down to controlling erosion. So crop management does matter, and I think that we can achieve those reductions that we're being asked for.